Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Culprate, Arythmos tessera, or just number 4. I probably butchered that, but this guy's not Greek. Culprate is the alias for IDM, dubstep, neuro, experimental, etc. producer John Hislop. This guy has had a small, if very dedicated cult following for quite a while now. This is actually not the first time I've covered him. Back at the end of 2020, I did a Some Stuff I Missed segment on his most widely acclaimed album, Deliverance, purely because it had gotten so frequently requested over so many years, and I still get lots of requests to cover it to this day from people who never saw that roundup. Link to that segment can be found in the description, but in the meantime, if you want a recap on my wider thoughts on Culprate's work, even if that roundup was my first time actually hearing anything he'd made, I would definitely consider myself a fan at this point. He didn't start out in mind-blowing territory right away. His debut album Flatline from 2011 is a solid enough collection of experimental dubstep and neuro styles that, while plenty of fun and very well produced, isn't all that memorable by today's standards. But he did show a lot more promise on his second album, Colors, which came out later that same year, showing a fair bit more variety in its sound design with a lot more ambitious ideas, and all being tied to a concept where each track was themed after a color. Did still run together a bit, but it's a great project in its own right. But of course, all of that seriously paled in comparison to his third album, the above-mentioned Deliverance from 2014, which came about thanks to him setting up an Indiegogo campaign in hopes of really upping his budget and going the extra mile with his sound design, bringing in all sorts of live instrumentation and guest studio musicians, and boy did he deliver, no pun intended. As I kinda mentioned when I did my Some Stuff I Missed segment on it, that album is kinda like what you get if you combine the sounds of, like, the modern wave of IDM neuro artists, like those on the Upscale label, with the lusher atmosphere and widely varied world music instrumentation of an outfit like Spangle. It's really damn impressive, especially for something released in 2014, before we saw a lot more artists try these kinds of sounds, and even still stands out as something special on that scene to this day. I do have my issues here and there, most notably the project is pretty front-loaded with all its most compelling ideas in the first 4 or 5 tracks, before delivering some samey and less exciting cuts in the middle, and the closer is serviceable but kind of anticlimax in comparison to the way it started, and there's a few flub transitions between tracks with some out-of-nowhere hard cuts, but these are all mostly nitpicks in the grander scheme of things. That album's only grown on me since I covered it, and I already rated it an 8.5 out of 10 2 years ago. Though the big question is, how does one even follow up an album like that at all? Is it even possible to top something like that? Well, it appears Culprate has taken the time-honored reproach of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, and is seen to more or less try and directly recapture what he did on his last album. It came about in the exact same way. He set up another Indiegogo campaign to get himself enough budget provided by his fans, although this one took a fair bit longer to come out, 8 years after the release of his last album. The campaign had already been successful by the time I covered Deliverance, and the album was released exclusively to his direct supporters several months ago, though obviously not being a direct supporter to his campaign myself, I couldn't very well cover it until it would see a wider, more publicly available release. At the very least, like a Bandcamp page or something. But now at long last, we're finally here. We have this highly anticipated 4th Culprate album. It finally saw that wider release at the end of last month. Is it as good or even better than Deliverance? No. That album still beats this one out by a fairly significant margin, but if you wanted more stuff that sounds like that album, you will definitely get it. It's closer in quality to his Colors album, maybe. I think that one's a little tiny bit better, but yeah, but this is a really damn solid project. It's impressive in all the same ways as Deliverance, with lots of varied sound design and lush instrumentation, and a fair bit tighter with only 7 tracks instead of 11. Heck, while I'm at it, none of the specific issues I had with Deliverance show up on this album. I've got no problems with this one from like a pacing or sequencing standpoint, and I think each of the 7 tracks on here are much closer to each other quality-wise than last time. But I don't think it has high points nearly as high as those on Deliverance either. Everything on here is about on the same level of quality as maybe those weaker tracks on that album's second half, like Within, Without, Yin, Relucent, all those. Which is to say, still really freaking good, within sniffing distance of being great in its own right, but maybe coming just the tiniest bit short of hitting that level for me. Going through individual tracks, we kick off with Anza, going for a strange mix of indie folk being played into his usual glitch-heavy mix. My first impression of this track is that it was meant to mirror Whispers Part 1 in all its mixes of psychedelic plucking guitar sounds going over all the lumbering percussion, and a present vocal guest in Brendan Day, aka Bevon. At first I really liked it and thought it made for a pretty solid way to start out. Though, not gonna lie, this track did get diminishing returns the more and more I sat with it, and after enough listens, I would actually have to mark this opener as the album's weakest link. It's obviously not because of the production, which is excellent as always, or even the tune, which is the single most memorable tune the album has to offer. Heck, it's probably the closest Culprate has come to constructing a traditionally structured song. The problem really just kind of comes down to the guest vocalist, I think. Like, this guy's not terrible by any stretch. He's a decent enough singer, but I started to listen to his lyrics. See me again. I don't just want to be your friend. I've cared so much since we began. Will I ever know, just as friends, the love I want to know? This feels like the wrong kind of lyrics for this particular kind of song. I feel like it's maybe a bit too direct and personal for the kind of album this is trying to be. Not to mention, being paired with the pissy tone of voice the vocalist carries and the oddly bitter and sinister tone of the melodies and chord progressions. All of this kind of added up to a track where it sounded like it was about some guy just making a big deal out of it just having been friend-zoned. And with all due respect, I don't want to hear that shit on a Culprate album. Like, the indie singer on Whispers Part 1 worked because the lyrics were a lot more abstract and poetic. Not about any topic in particular, but fit the tone of the album as a whole. This one, it just kind of feels off, more out of place the more I sat with it. The good news is that none of the other tracks on here bother me like the opener did. None of them stick in my head quite as much either, but none of them are specifically trying for that. You will still get your fill of top quality glitch fests, and as expected, it will all be best enjoyed, giving it your full attention. Koloni MaiTai is where Culprate really starts to delve deep into his sound design expertise, featuring lots of sparse but high detail percussion that can switch between sounding like stomping on cracking ice or like a running dishwasher, featuring side tracks into various modular synths and one especially fantastic breakdown driven by kalimbas and what sounds like a full orchestral string section. And of course there's those samples about synesthesia and associating things with colors, I suppose as a subtle callback to his second album. See, there's some vocal interjections that feel like they fit well into the mix. Fly is an impressive showcase of all sorts of different guitar textures fluttering over each other with some kick-ass solos and a whole bunch of eastern flutes at the end. And then there's The Psychology of James Berland, which does not actually remind me much of the memoirs of Gregory Otterman, but is another one of the most impressive cuts for sure. Lots more light stuttered guitars, frantic drum and bass percussion and airy sample chops, a glitch hop section in the middle, acid breakdowns, a jazzy bossa nova-like section near the end, and capped off with one last big flute solo at the very end. Pretty kick-ass. Jalaana, as per its Hindi title, goes all out on Indian influence, with guest vocals from Mansi and Subho, plenty of sitar and bansuri, and of course, all the amen breaks. Like, the track does start out almost more ambient-centric, but after like a minute and a half or so turns on to like full-on drum and bass and even breakcore with flute solos attempting to flutter over the dense and chaotic sea of hyperspeed percussion breakdowns. Another great cut to be sure, and I wouldn't even consider that to be one of my major favorites. I got pulled in a decent bit more by following cut Muerte de la Dama, which may not be as frantic or intense, but does feel quite a bit more emotionally involved, starting out with these really dramatic flamenco guitar patterns going over dark pianos and crashing but very slow and sparse acoustic drums, really nailing down that heavy feel. And while the section in the middle with nothing but guitars is less interesting, it finally pays off into this ambient section at the end that also feels particularly heavy. It's got this flute oboe-like sound, I suppose that's called a duduk, going over some very sparse and low-key waves of orchestral strings and field recordings of a campfire. A subtle but dramatic way for this track to go out. And then there's the closer. Now, of course, I did mention before that I wasn't crazy about, like, Deliverance's closer, Relucent, which is a really impressive cut out of context, but a bit of an anticlimax finish in context. And I am happy to report that this problem does not carry over to this album, and the closer Nammu is the strongest cut in the bunch, stretching on for nearly 12 minutes and making full use of that time. And it gets really freaky and experimental in many parts, like in the first 30 seconds or so, it's just nothing but strange atonal mechanical ambience. Before the first notes of kalimba come in, then the orchestral sounds come back with some modulated male voices. I suppose as a roundabout way of tying back to the first track. There are sections of what sounds like stuttered pianos so thoroughly glitched up to basically form an ambient pad, and lengthy acid breakdowns. There's another glitch hop section with jazzy Rhodes piano chords plinking away, an excellent sax solo. And of course there's pretty much the entire last 4 minutes of the track where everything just completely deconstructs and falls apart in a strange, foreboding, experimental heap. It kind of reminds me of what Vale Smith did on his track Everything, but taken to the furthest possible extreme. All the synths and bells and kalimbas falling over each other and not even forming any kind of coherent melodies or chords until finally fading away in minimal stuttering effects right at the end. Goddamn, now that's the way you close an album. It is clear that the 8 years of work were not wasted. As you'd expect, there is tons going on to pay attention to in every second of every track, and it might even be more dense than Deliverance. Okay, no it's not, but it's not far off at least. But yet there's still just that nagging feeling I had at the end of so many listens. Very impressed by what I've heard, but still feeling like something was missing. The fact that the cut that most easily stuck in my head was also my least favorite, with the opener, probably doesn't help. But I think it really just comes down to this album suffering from the same issue so many neuro artists have over the years, wherein doubling down so heavily on making the sound design as impressive as possible, they can get too caught up in the details and lose sight of the big picture, not doing as well to make all these tracks really stand out as standalone pieces, and resulting in an album that, while impressive in the moment, can kinda go in one ear and out the other. Deliverance didn't have this problem, and it's almost kinda unfair that this album was tasked with following up an album as stellar as that. Like, it's very rare for any artists to, pull in avalanches and match the quality of their masterpiece after such a lengthy wait. And the fact that this doesn't measure up to that album in my eyes isn't really that much of a crack against it. That bar was near impossible to top. Maybe it would have helped more if it didn't feel like it wasn't more or less forcing a direct comparison and did more to set itself apart as its own thing, even if this method was probably safer in terms of building hype and that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, while it's great to hear more material like this, there's just not any novelty to it at this point. I feel like as crazy as this stuff is, I've heard it all before to some extent, and that makes it harder for me to say I see myself coming back to this much in the future. But still, all the props to Culprate for finally getting this all out there in the world. While I don't think it's going to be like a year-end list contender, there is definitely enough goodness to be found here to recommend giving it a shot. This is some very good stuff, and I will have to give it a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.